Titanic never sank. People said, what are you talking about? Of course it sank.
Are you talking about its sister ship?
Its sister ship is what sank.
Right.
Olympic. They switched the names on the ships because the Olympic was crippled. It had a couple of collisions, and they couldn't get insurance on it. And without the insurance, they couldn't operate it. And it was a brand new ship, and they had to start scrapping it, and they couldn't get enough money out of the scrap to pay for it. So Morgan comes up with the idea, let's just call it the Titanic, and we'll see that it sinks all right, and it'll look like it ran into an iceberg and so forth, and we'll rescue all the people, which they intended to do, or most of them. But that plot went awry. There's no doubt in my mind that some of the people in high executive positions in the Federal Reserve and in our government, especially the Treasury Department, those who designed the U.S. dollar, for example, and the symbols, the seal of the government and so forth, look at the imagery on it, the symbols that come right out of the occult world. And that just didn't happen by accident.
Hi, Mr. Griffin, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go.
Yes, sir.
Right, very good.
Gotcha.
Thanks for jumping on and doing this for us. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Well, I mean, we're already recording and stuff, so if it's okay with you, I mean, we've got a list of questions for you.
Well, I hope I can do justice for it.
Oh, I'm sure.
A little bit out of breath. I've been running around this morning. Had to get the car in for some maintenance. I just had to force down a little bit of food and swallow some apple juice, and probably be gurgling here as we talk. Anyway,
no worries.
You'll be editing, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. Don't worry. We'll make you look good. It's all.
It'll be great.
No worries.
Here, before we get started,
I think making me look good, you're going to have some skills.
I've been doing this for a long time. You too loud? Or?
No, I can't hear my left ear for whatever. It just like popped out.
Oh, really?
Okay, so let's get into it here. So in the Federal Reserve, 1913, our economic system and financial system is pretty much based off of that, the Federal Reserve Act that happened then. Can you kind of just explain what the Federal Reserve itself is, and if it's federal and if it's a reserve?
Well, yeah, that's always a joke because it's a good opening line to say, well, the Federal Reserve is not federal and has no reserves. However, and then it's because of an eye-opener to people. They don't know what you're talking about. But it's true. It's not federal. It's private. They deliberately chose words that would deceive the average person from really understanding that the Federal Reserve is a cartel. And people say cartel. They're not even quite sure what that is. They think that the only cartels in the world are the ones that are pushing drugs and bringing them up out of Mexico and things like that. But cartels have been around for a long time. And it's any grouping of competitors in a particular field who have decided they don't want to compete anymore. And they've come to cartel agreements between themselves not to compete. So they'll fix prices so that nobody charges a price that's any different. They'll offer the same goods or services, the same quality just about. The policies will be the same so that they can raise their prices and avoid the vigors of competition between themselves. And the world has been cartelized for decades and decades. And it really all began about the end of World War I. And from that time, all the industrial nations, the corporations in those nations are joined together and came to cartel agreements. Factories decided, well, you can have North America, we get South America. You produce tractors, we'll produce automobiles, and so forth like that. And especially certain industries like banking and the pharmaceutical industry, healthcare, and utilities. These were very highly advanced cartels. And that's something they don't teach in school. At least I was not aware of it when I went through school. They might have a paragraph about a cartel, but you can write books and books on cartels. So the short answer to the question of what is the Federal Reserve System, it's a banking cartel. It's no different than banana cartel, oil cartel. And that means the great banks of the nation and of the world in their respective countries have come together and agreed to not compete with each other too seriously. They'll compete on the basis of advertising, that kind of thing, and they want customers more than the other guy, but they don't compete on the basis of products or services or convenience or prices or profit margins or anything like that. And that's something you can easily observe. The interest rates in one bank are the same interest rates pretty much as every other bank. Even if they wanted to break out of that mold, they can't because they have made cartel agreements. Well, the Federal Reserve Act is nothing but a cartel agreement between banks. And that's why it was written or created and conceived under a great deal of secrecy. It was not done in Washington, D.C. or in New York, where the banks seem to be clustered. It was done in the privacy of a private club, island in Georgia called Jekyll Island, which is why I titled the book "The Creature from Jekyll Island." That was a privately owned island by the super wealthy, mostly the big industrialists and the big banks. The cartelists, in other words, owned that island, and it was they had a clubhouse there, still standing, a beautiful place, and you can go have a great lunch there. You can check in and check in one of the old rooms that have been very well maintained and updated. They have hot water in there now and pretty nice accommodations, but it's the old building, and you get the flavor of what it was at the turn of the last century. So the super wealthy went there. It was their resort island, and they went there and held a meeting in November of 1910, and that's the purpose of the meeting was to hammer together, and come to an agreement as to how the members of the cartel would work with each other if they consolidated the whole banking industry of the nation under one roof. And so that's really what it is. And once you get your head around that, then a lot of things clear up that otherwise don't make any sense. You think, what are these guys up to? They're supposed to be a government agency, and yet everything they do is not for the benefit of the people. It seems to be for the benefit of the banks. I wonder how that turns out. Well, it's because they are the banks. And the Federal Reserve is the bank, the banking system. It's not the government at all. And it was quite a coup because when you read the Federal Reserve Act and understand how this cartel works, they not only created a cartel, but they went into partnership with the top politicians. The government not only allowed it, they participated in it. It became kind of a mutually advantageous arrangement in which the reason the banks got the cartel approved by Congress is because Congress and some of the more clever politicians within the government understood that the banking system could provide a great service to them. Up until that point, if government wanted to get extra money, they had to tax people for it. And that was very unpopular. Keep raising taxes. Wars are very expensive. All the welfare state is very expensive. And you can't just keep taxing people until you reach a certain point, and then all of a sudden you've got a tax revolt on your hands. A lot of tyrannical governments experienced that. So they were always looking for a way to get more money, to milk more money out of the population without the population realizing that they were paying a tax to the government. So this was the advantage to the politicians, what I would call the crooks in the government, the predator class, the crime syndicate people in the government. They went into partnership with the banks, who also were crooks and so forth, and they had a mutually advantageous relationship. And they scratched each other's back, and that's the way it's been ever since, except for maybe we'll talk about some of the latest changes, but one of the changes that has already happened, probably that most people don't recognize, is that in the beginning, the concept was that the government was supposed to regulate the banks in the interest of the people. And that made a lot of sense. It sounded good. Yeah, let's regulate these banks. We know that these big bad banks are doing bad things, and it's not in our best interest. So let's get those honest, dependable congressmen and senators to regulate the banks, those good people. And that was the dream, the fantasy. And so that was the reason behind the whole Federal Reserve Act, is to put the government in charge of regulating the banking system, which most everybody recognized was not really in the best interest of the common person. Well, that's how it started off. But every year there's an amendment or every few years there's an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act. There have been many, many amendments to it. It's not at all what it was when it started. It's much more powerful, has no limits now. And at the end of this process, you come out of the process like at the end of World War II and a decade or two later, the government is no longer regulating the banks. The banks are regulating the government. Mm-hmm. And that's the reality of our day. And that was a profound change. Mm-hmm. If you can create money out of nothing, you can buy politicians easily. You've got an endless amount of money. And that's what politicians want, is endless amounts of money. And you've got it. And you can give it to them. And you don't have to tax the people for it. You can just make it and flood it into the economy. And of course, that taxes the people indirectly in the form of inflation. Prices start going up. But the average person doesn't understand that inflation really is a hidden tax. They don't see the government involved in that at all. And so forth. So that's how the scam works, and it's worked beautifully. And now, of course, we're coming into a new phase, another huge step in the evolution of this banking crime, I guess you'd call it, the theft, the deception, and maybe we can talk about that. I think that's pretty much on your agenda.
Yes, sir. But before we get into the kind of stuff going on today, you obviously have covered a lot there, but we want to kind of go back to the Federal Reserve's inception, because you mentioned, the Jekyll Island and the mystery and the secrecy surrounding that, especially at the time. And there's a reason why they had to do that in secret, because the people were very privy to the fact that a central bank would be extremely, they're very opposed to the idea of a central bank at the time. Part of why they named it as such, the Federal Reserve, is to hide that fact. But can you kind of talk about what the climate of banking was like leading up to that, and kind of the bank runs and kind of the cycle of banking at that time?
Yeah, that's a very rich and long history that goes back centuries, and from the very beginning, banking was pretty corrupt. Why? Because it can be. It's because people don't understand money. It's although at one point in our history, I think people, the average person at least, did understand money in much more detail than they do now. They understood that money was something that had tangible value in itself, other than money. They understood that gold and silver, for example, had value. Even if you didn't use it for money, it had value for other things. And so there was a long history where people were close to the reality of what money really was and should be. And in the beginning, of course, it was things like plants and animals that you could eat. I mean, the very word pecuniary, a pecuniary arrangement or contract means a monetary arrangement. Well, that comes from the Latin word cow. Pecunius was a cow. And in the very beginning, or at least in Europe, parts of Europe, cows were considered to be money. That's why they had herds of cattle, and still why they have herds of cattle. Not because they can use more than one or two cows, it's because those cows are negotiable. You can use them like money, and you can buy empires with them if you have enough cows. And even before that, money was considered to be jars of wheat. And you dig through some of the old ruins in the ancient world, the earliest civilizations like, let's see, what would they be? Well, anyway, the ancient civilizations over in the Middle East, I'll come back to it in a moment. There's a word that
Sumeria, is everything in there?
Thank you. Yeah, Sumerian. It's the first known civilization on Earth. It's an interesting thing because it just shows up, completely developed. There's no evolution of it. You don't see a little crude civilization and then a half a civilization or a full. All of a sudden, there it is. It's got music. It's got mathematics. It's got water systems. It's got plumbing and roads. It's got languages. I mean, it's got philosophy, and that's another topic in itself. Where did it come from? Maybe it sprang from the earth. Maybe it didn't. But if it did, there's no evidence of where it came from. It's all been destroyed. So anyway, all the way back in time, you dig through some of those old those stones where they chiseled messages on. The language was always recorded in stone. And those tablets have been unearthed, and they thought, oh, here's the history of mankind going way back to Sumeria. And they started translating them, and it was very disappointing because most of them were nothing but accounting records for who had so many jars of wheat on storage here, and how many jars of wheat were owed to Joe Smith, and how many were on loan to Mary Brown, and so forth. But they did find some interesting tablets in there, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's another story too. But mostly these records were just accounting records. So anyway, in our topic today, the accounting records are the things that are important because we know from them that money has originated as something of intrinsic value that could be used quite readily for something other than money, which is one of the features that makes money really good, is that intrinsic value. We don't have that, of course, today, which is the reason money can just disappear and you can wind up with a room full of paper bills that is, I'm a trillionaire, but it's only the trillions of dollars or yen or Deutschmarks or whatever they call them are only good for one thing, and that's for burning in the furnace and heating your house. So that's civilizations have gone through that many times whenever they abandon this thing called intrinsic value. So all of that is just background, and people today have forgotten that before the Federal Reserve came into being, already there had been a great departure from that primitive, if you want to call it primitive, understanding of money, which people had to understand because they had to go into the marketplace and negotiate. It was sort of a blend between barter and using money as an intermediate, a medium of exchange. They had to be close to money. They had to understand, oh, this coin, I'm not sure that's really gold. We have to test it. They were very, very suspicious. You should be when you're engaging in monetary transactions. We have forgotten how to be suspicious or how to be cautious. We just think, well, what do the experts say? We never dreamed that the experts could be crooks. We never think about that. So anyway, I wandered from the issue, but that before the Federal Reserve came along, we had already, as a nation and as a world, had greatly departed from this understanding where the people really knew what money was because they were dealing with it and having to create it themselves. They had to grow the cattle. They had to plant the wheat. They had to make the jars. They had to, make the accounting records, chisel them in stone. It took a lot of effort. They were really close to what money was. All right. Then the idea of having paper money came along. And paper, nothing wrong with paper money if it represents the real money that's in storage someplace. In other words, receipt money is perfectly good and started off as good money when say you had some gold coins and you're kind of tired of worrying about them being stolen from you. You had to stay up at night. You had to hire somebody to patrol your house or your encampment so that the crooks couldn't come in and steal your money and slaughter you in order to get your money. This is pretty scary stuff when you had a lot of money in those days. You had to have security teams, you had little armies to protect yourself and so forth. So this is where the trouble all began, because there were certain people in the community that called them goldsmiths, and they made the coins, they made the jewelry, and they kept the what we would call the bullion, or the bars, or the melted globs of gold and silver. They kept them in their vault, and they had guards. And so it got to the point where anybody other than the goldsmiths who had a little extra wealth, a little savings in the form of gold or silver, coins or bars or chunks or whatever, they would go to the goldsmiths, to the jewelers, and they'd ask if they could pay the jewelers to guard their silver and gold as well. And it was a nice arrangement. And they said, of course, we'll do it for a fee. And they said, sold. The fee was reasonable. Here's my gold. You give me a receipt for it. And I trust you. Now, when I come back with that receipt, you've agreed to give me back gold, right? Gold. Yeah, of course. Well, that was the beginning of banking. That was called a bank. Eventually it became called a bank. But in the beginning, it was just called the goldsmith, who issued a paper receipt for the gold and said, yeah, if you bring the receipt back, I'll give you your gold back. Meanwhile, you pay me so much a month or so much a year to store your gold and guard it. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you honor your word. Now, you have third-party risk, as they call it. Now your gold is no longer in your possession. You have to trust a third party to keep their word. That they said they're going to guard it for you. You hope that they do. Well, that's where the trouble begins, because not everybody is honest. Let's just put it that way. And I'm sure it happened something like this. In the beginning, here's this goldsmith. I can picture him in my mind's eye, and he's sitting on this huge stack of gold and silver coins, and he's doing a good job of guarding it, and he's making money by collecting the fees, and he's honest, and he gives the gold back when they bring the receipts and all of that. And one day, his son comes in and says, "Hey, Pop, I've been looking at that stack of gold out there in the warehouse. It's just sitting there. It's idle. And we lend our gold out at interest, right?" Father said, "Yeah, we lend our gold out at interest." "Well, why don't we lend out this gold that's not ours and charge interest on it?" "Oh, well, we can't do that because it's not ours. And we didn't agree to do that." So he's an honest guy. "Oh, Dad, look, we've been watching this now for a couple of years, and at no time has more than 10% of our depositors come in and ask for their gold. 10% is all we have to keep. The rest of it we can loan out and earn interest on it. And it won't hurt anybody. They won't know any different." "Oh, I can't do that," says the old guy. Well, he dies eventually. Now the son is the banker. And sure enough, he institutes his idea. Now we're going to loan out. We're going to loan out maybe 30% of the gold. Nice margin, still in reserve in case people come in and want their gold. We know that only 10% will ever come in at one time, but we're gonna hold 60%. So that's a real fat safety margin. Now his son says, "Pop, look, you should loan out all of what we can." "Oh, we can't do that because it's too risky." So then that generation dies. Now comes the grandson. He's in charge, and he keeps as time goes by, they keep loaning out more and more of what they would call the reserves of things that are supposedly on deposit. They're not even theirs. And eventually, you've got what they call fractional reserve banking.
Right.
That's how it all comes. The fraction gets smaller and smaller and smaller till finally it's not only at that 10%, but it's below that 10%. And of course, in our world today, it's at 0%. So we no longer have fractional reserve. We've crossed the line, and we have zero reserve, which is just called fiat money. So that's kind of a short version of what happens over history. So we're living in an age today where money no longer is tied to anything of intrinsic value whatsoever. It's just faith in whoever we trust to run the monetary system, and we don't even want to know how it works because we think it's too complicated. And they love to hear that attitude.
Right.
They just don't worry about it. We're the experts. We'll take care of you. And that's the world in which we live today.
That's very interesting. And, the history of usury is very interesting as well. And we've made videos before on the Rothschild dynasty, and you can actually run back usury to them. I'm sure it's been a concept before that, but the modern day system kind of runs back to their lineage. You've said in previous interviews that JP Morgan was even he was funded by the Rothschilds, and which is very interesting, kind of a secret history that people don't know that. And even Soros takes money from the Rothschilds. Another interesting name.
It goes on.
It definitely goes on. And the history of the Federal Reserve itself, Paul Warburg was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty and was one of the people that went to Jekyll Island and was one of the founders. Now, that brings up a lot of interesting questions because it's like, was this Federal Reserve a international play? And is this even something that's like, was this a global inception? Like what exactly, who do you see as like the people who really started the Federal Reserve? Like, do you think it was the Rothschilds? Do you think it was a kind of a cabal or a group of different individuals?
Who was the cartel?
Who was behind some of the names that we know?
I think it was, from what I can tell, and I've looked at a lot of that literature from the origins of the system. As far as I could tell, they had close relationships with the their brotherhood, so to speak, in other countries. But the great impetus was, okay, it's our turn in the United States to do our version of what our friends over in Europe and our grandfathers over in Europe did. And it was only later that they began to think in terms of, we're going to amalgamate this into a universal global system. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I've never seen anything in the literature, in their own writings, in their own notes or memoirs or diaries or anything, which indicated that they had this global system in mind at the time of creating the Federal Reserve. Now, I'm sure in some cases they thought about it, but it never shows up in the literature, any of the debates, none of the speeches and the memoirs, none of the biographies ever deal with it. So I'm assuming that the idea was that, okay, this is how it works over in England. Let's just copy that system and we'll have our own version of the scam. And later on, of course, it amalgamated and they said, look, this is the world we're living in. Why don't we just, let's take care of the whole thing at one time and we'll join together and we'll conquer the world. So that's my opinion, but it really doesn't make a difference whether it started off that way or not. That's how it evolved, and it is global today.
Gotcha. And, it is interesting because there's a lot of, as we're saying, secrecy. It's hard to know exactly like what happened. So we're very grateful for your book, by the way. It's shed a lot of light on, and put a lot of pieces together and like kind of the whole story. And, it's really interesting is that, when the act was passed, a third of Congress wasn't there and a fifth of the House wasn't there, and it was passed during Christmas time. Do you kind of see, do you think that happened on purpose? And what's more, there are some people that opposed the very idea of such things and just so happened to die on that Titanic a couple of years prior. Do you see these, there's the obvious, like, never attribute malice where incompetence can be as Hanlon's razor, but I don't think that statement applies to bankers. No,
you have to be on your guard when you get people like that. Well, I don't see it that way. And naturally, I'm not going to say you want to see it that way, but you wouldn't be surprised to see, you expect to see it that way. Let's put it in that form, because we know that people like J.P. Morgan was about as ruthless as you can get to be. The story of the sinking of the Titanic itself is evident of that. The Titanic never sank. Yeah, I don't know if you guys know that or not, but the Titanic never sank. People say, what are you talking about? Of course it sank.
Are you talking about its sister ship?
Its sister ship is what sank. Right. Olympic. They switched the names on the ships because the Olympic was crippled. It had a couple of collisions, and they couldn't get insurance on it. And without the insurance, they couldn't operate it. And it was a brand new ship, and they had to start scrapping it, and they couldn't get enough money out of the scrap to pay for it. So Morgan comes up with the idea, let's just call it the Titanic, and we'll see that it sinks all right, and it'll look like it ran into an iceberg and so forth, and we'll rescue all the people, which they intended to do, or most of them. But that plot went awry with as part of the story. And so they sank the Olympic so they could collect insurance on it, which was otherwise uninsurable. And what we called the Olympic really was the Titanic and so forth. So it's an interesting part of the story. And that was all concocted by J.P. Morgan. So Morgan was capable of doing anything. And so we think, well, yeah, he probably did make sure that his opponents on the Federal Reserve System idea were on board. And he probably wanted to see them murdered and so forth. I don't see any evidence of that, although I wouldn't put it past him. But he didn't have to do that, because these guys that went down, they were opponents. They disagreed with what he was trying to do. They were not part of his group, but they weren't really opposing him. The bill was going to go through Congress. It was a shoo-in. So there was no need for that. That's why I'm a little bit cautious about jumping on the bandwagon and saying, yeah, they killed these guys, and that's how they did it. I don't see any evidence of it. It's plausible that they could have, but I just don't see any reason for them to do it. They were not a threat to him.
Okay, gotcha. Well, what about the other part where a bunch of Congress and the House wasn't there? Do you think they did some things on purpose like that too, and pass during Christmas?
Again, so it's the idea that that was necessary is not true. I mean, the bill.
Oh, okay, I see.
It was wrapped up, but I do think they would rather have it go through at a time when there would be very little debate.
Right.
They want to just push it through. They didn't want anybody criticizing it. They didn't want any debate, anything negative showing up in the record. So what better time to push it through and keep it out of the newspapers and everything than to do it at the Christmas break? And I think that's what they did. It was a strategy to keep it out of the news. Right,
which we see that stuff kind of happens like today too.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, it does happen today. But we had to get your opinion on it because you never know, and you're very knowledgeable, man. You've studied this topic for a very long time, so
well, you have to be careful to jump on the conspiracy theories.
Of course,
they're usually right, by the way.
Yeah,
but they're not always right, so you have to be cautious.
Speaking of that, the notes issued from the Federal Reserve are very interesting. And I don't know if you've studied symbology at all, but even just take the $1 bill. And do you think that the Federal Reserve has any ties to any secret societies or anything like that? Yeah, I'll leave the floor open there. I have no idea. I'm just wondering.
Well, the symbolism is a dead giveaway. But I think the answer to the question, did the Federal Reserve have any ties to the occult?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is to be found in a sort of a philosophical issue, which is what is the Federal Reserve? How can an agreement, which is, let me back off. Let me start this over again. To know whether or not the Federal Reserve was involved in anything like the occult is to first understand that the Federal Reserve does not exist any more than any other group of any kind exists as a tangible thing. Corporations do not exist. Governments do not exist. You can't touch a government. You can't touch a corporation. You can't touch a group. You can touch individuals. It's like the word forest. Forest does not exist. There's trees. They're real, but forest is an abstraction in the mind. It's a mathematical concept like the number 7. So the Federal Reserve and all these other groups are abstractions. We have to realize that when we talk about these abstractions, we're talking about the people in them who dominate them and make the decisions in the name of the group. So it's the politicians that we're talking about. It's the corporate managers, the board of directors, the executives in a corporation we're talking about. And in the Federal Reserve, we're talking about the banks, and the banks themselves are groups. So we're talking about the heads and the owners of the various banks in the cartel. So now that we understand we're talking about people, there's no doubt in my mind that many of these people, if not most of them for all we know, were definitely involved in the occult. The occult has been much more of a factor in the life of the world than I think than most people realize.
Yeah,
they're going to learn quite a bit lately because it's coming to the front. It's coming up. Satanism is coming up out of the ground, and we see, gosh, all of these people in high places are actually Satanists. Wow, that's absurd. I never dreamed of something like that. But we're going to see that it's much deeper and much larger and more powerful than we ever dreamed. So the short answer to your question is there's no doubt in my mind that some of the people in high executive positions in the Federal Reserve and in our government, especially the Treasury Department, those who designed the U.S. dollar, for example, and the symbols, the seal of the government and so forth, look at the imagery on it, the symbols that come right out of the occult world. And that just didn't happen by accident. The whole design of Washington, D.C., if you look at the geographic design, the obelisks, all these things are symbols from the occult world. And that didn't happen by accident.
Would you mind going a little bit more into the symbolism of the dollar? Can you, I don't know how much you have offhand, but can you kind of break some of that down by chance?
Well, I'm probably not the person for that.
Okay.
Although it's easy enough to find, it's not arcane knowledge anymore. The all-seeing eye, for example, is the most obvious part of it. That goes way back to ancient Egypt. It goes back to the period of the pyramids and prior to the pyramids even. And so there's something that's very ancient involved. Now the question is, well, did the Masonic groups that we know about in more recent times, did they just take that imagery from ancient Egypt and use it? Or is there some kind of continuity that goes back historically? Well, this is unknown. I don't think you could prove it either way. But even if it was borrowed, even if there is no continuity, the fact that it was taken and used implies that there was an occult intention, at least on the part of the people who did that. So the occult is very strong in our world today, even though it's somewhat hidden from view unless you know what to look for. Now, the all-seeing eye, as I said, is the most obvious part of that. And you look at all of the celebrities and Hollywood and the politicians; they take their pictures with their hands, in certain positions. You have the triangle over the eyes just to make sure that you get it if you understand what you're looking at. So they're trying very, very hard now to communicate the fact that, hey, we're part of it. Now, let the dummies worry about it. But those who understand, we want you to know you and I are on the same team. It's a way of secretly delivering the secret handshake. Oh, you're a brother. Got the secret handshake. We got the secret symbolism and so forth. So it's real.
That is super interesting. We'll have to dive more into that. I know I've researched a little bit about that, going all the way back to like Babylon. I don't know if you've heard of like Babylonian money magic. I don't know. It goes where Egyptian mystery schools too. It gets so crazy. I don't know. I'll have to do a really
crazy. Yeah.
But it's real.
It is crazy, I think. But you ought to find some experts on this topic. I would not be one of those. I just read books on it. I haven't done any original research.
Yeah, maybe we'll dive into the symbology next.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Okay, well, let's hop back into kind of where we are today, maybe. 10 years ago, you did an interview with Book TV where you talked about some of the FDIC's history and what it represents, so to speak. Can you kind of explain the moral hazard that the FDIC has?
Yes, I have to get my mind back around that. It's been a long time since I've talked about it or even thought about it. But moral hazard is a phrase that comes from the insurance world, and most insurance policies, I believe, will have at least some mention of the principle, if not the word or the phrase. Moral hazard means that the insurance will not cover any event where it's advantageous to the insured person to have the accident or the loss that the insurance covers, because it's a temptation for them to actually, the old joke about, hey, Sammy, I'm sorry, I hear about the fire in your store. And he said, oh, no, that's not till tomorrow.
I'm still buying my insurance.
It's a joke, but it's not a joke because that implies moral hazard. If you can insure your store, let's say your clothing store, that might be worth, with the inventory and the building and everything, it might be worth, let's say, $100,000, and you could insure it for $500,000. There's a moral hazard there. It's a temptation for you to burn down your store and collect $5,000 or $500,000 for something that's only $100,000. So all insurance companies, if they're smart, have clauses that prevent moral hazard. Well, this we saw that in 9/11, didn't we? With the collapse of the Twin Towers. I mean, the fellow that bought those buildings just before they were knocked down overinsured them by far for what they're worth. And so having them destroyed was a great profit move as far as he was concerned. He had moral hazard. And how the insurance company let that go is another story. That's something that needs to be looked into. I think they had inside help, and they literally milked all the investors in the insurance company and stole the money from the investors and from the insurance company reserves to make a cool profit for the people that had violated moral hazard in the insurance of the Twin Towers. That's another story. But anyway, now when it comes to the FDIC, we have the moral hazard is exposed there too, because the banks are insured against losses to their money, no matter what. There's no question as to what causes the loss. If the investment goes bad and the depositor's money is lost, in the interest of protecting the people, protecting the depositors, you understand, it's not the banks, who protect those poor depositors, the FDIC will cover the loss for the bank.
Mm-hmm.
They're really insuring the bank, not the people, but they always focus on the people. So the banks, therefore, have no motive to be conservative in their investment strategies. They'll invest in risky deals to get a higher interest rate. And of course, the risky deals go sour more often than not. That's why the higher interest rate. But when the risky deals do go sour, the FDIC now has to pay off the loss because they're an insurer. And so you see there's moral hazard there. The banks are encouraged by the very arrangement of having federal deposit insurance. They're encouraged to make risky investments because they make more interest on those and they have no liability in the case of the loss. So things like that are built into the political system all up and down the ladder, and certainly in the banking system.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And you say that like the system will ultimately end up going to zero, and the people on the inside know this. And so that kind of brings us to today. And there's talk of it going to zero, but not exactly going to zero. More morphing into something else per se, the CBDCs. And so do you think are we witnessing the creature itself change and kind of metamorphosize into something new? And what exactly do you see that as being?
I think we're seeing what may be called the final metamorphosis of the monetary system of the world. It has evolved from a rather primitive barter system to commodity money, and then fractional reserve money, and then fiat money, and all of that. And now it's moving to digital money. Of course, we're in digital money right now, but it's moving to digital currency that has no intrinsic value. I mean, you can have digital currency that has intrinsic value if you have gold reserves or something else, real estate or something of real intrinsic value behind it. But if there's nothing but just digits, which is what they're talking about with the central bank digital currencies. Now, they're also talking about having some gold in there too, but that's just to sell the idea. Anybody should be aware that there's quite a bit of historical precedent for banks to start off sounding pretty conservative just to get public support for their propositions. And then after the system is running for a few years or a few decades, those conservative measures are withdrawn one by one, quietly until finally they're all gone. That's what happened to our monetary system. We first went into the Federal Reserve System. There was some silver and gold backing the money. Not all of it, but there's a fraction of it. And now, of course, there's none. That was taken away bit by bit over the years. So they're talking about central bank digital currencies today, and they always throw in the world that if China does it or if Russia does it, there'll be some gold there to back the system up. Not all of it, but some. And people, so have some gold. That's good. Let's support it. They don't realize that another 20 years down the line, no, there won't be any gold. It's just to sell the idea. It's a bait and switch kind of a plan. They've done this many, many times throughout history. So what is this final evolution? It's not just digital currency, because right now, I think the majority of the commercial transactions or the retail transactions are done with digital currency, credit cards, in other words. But you supposedly could be able to convert a credit card into cash to put in your pocket and put it in a tin can and bury it in the backyard, or put it on your mattress or something. It's your money. You can do whatever you want to. You could burn it if you want to. It's your money. Well, so it takes a digital form on way back to you. It always comes back to you if you want it. What we're talking about now is not that way. It's digital in the same sense as a credit card, but it's not yours. It belongs to them. And they'll allow you to benefit from using it as long as you are obedient to them. And if you are not obedient, it's their money and you have no access to it. They turn a switch. That's why they want your fingerprint, your facial recognition. They want your blood, they want your heartbeat. They want to know what you're thinking, so they know where you are, what you're doing at all moments. in case you step out of line and you're even thinking about not being obedient, they'll turn the switch and you won't be able to buy food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and you'll be out in the street, sitting on the street with a little tin cup, asking for people to put money in it, but they can't because they don't have any money either.
Right.
They put into the tin cup and you will die. That's the world we're going into. And this is something that the bankers have been dreaming about for centuries. And it wasn't until digital currencies, or so-called cyber currencies, came along that this dream became a potential reality. And they're just chomping at the bit to get it going so fast. We finally are there. We have the technology. We can make it work. We can make it work. And this is what's happening. And we're in that phase now. And we're going through the point, I believe, where the central banks of the world recognize that their system is through. They're so deeply in debt now that it's ridiculous. Nobody in their right mind thinks that there's ever any chance of paying off the debt. The debt's just got to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in relationship to goods and services. And that means that the value of the monetary units keeps going down and down and down and down till finally it has to hit zero. And we're going to see that, I think, in our lifetime, maybe even in my lifetime, but probably for sure in your lifetime. And so these people are not stupid. I think they made a decision quite a while ago. This is coming. This is coming. So we're not going to just wait for it to happen. Let us make it happen so we can control the rhythm and the process of it and every detail of it. We will make it happen. Which explains what's going on today. These people are deliberately trying to destroy the monetary system so that there will be famine, there will be food riots, there will be people starving, there might even be cannibalism, that they're destroying food supplies, they're blowing up warehouses with food, so there will be no way to get food. They're making it impossible for the truckers to deliver food because they're putting extra requirements on their diesel engines so they can't. So they're doing everything they can to bring the economy to a halt, to a screeching, desperate, destructive halt, so that people will be desperate. They'll be worrying about sheer survival. Where's our money? What happened to our money? I can't afford $5,000 for a loaf of bread. This is absurd, So then they come in as the saviors. We'll say we have something called a central bank digital currency. This will solve the problem. And the people will say, thank God you guys are here. And, thank you. Where do I get my digital currency? And they'll line up for it, like they lined up for the vaccines. There'll be long lines of people waiting to get the final death blow in the banking system. This is what they have planned. Now, when they finally get to the point where there's nothing but digits, and it's not your digits, it's theirs, and you get to use it to buy something to live off, only if you're obedient and not challenge them in any way. This is the ultimate dream that these people have had for quite a while. And if we don't stop it, that's what we're going to wind up living in. So I'd like to conclude with that grim scenario by describing one of my favorite documentaries produced by the BBC. It was The Life of George Orwell. Very interesting person who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm and other books like that, which were quite descriptive of what's going on in the world today. And Orwell died of tuberculosis, and his life is portrayed very well in this documentary. And at the end of this story, he's on his deathbed, and he's dying from TB, and he's having trouble breathing and talking. And there's a young lady in the room. She's portraying herself as a news reporter, and she's trying to get a last interview from him before he conks. And she says, "Well, Mr. Orwell, your book presents a very grim picture for the future. It's very, very disturbing. What do you recommend that people do about it?"
Yeah.
You remember that? And it was done so well. He's sitting there gasping for breath. He says, "Well, there's only one thing that can be done. And that is," and then he looks directly at the camera and at the viewer. And he says, "Don't let it happen." Wow, what a line that is. The only thing we can do is not how do we recover from it, because it may not be possible. We've got to stop it from happening. So every time I talk about the grim picture that I presented a moment ago, I feel compelled to remind everybody that don't wait for it to happen and then figure out what you're going to do about it. Whatever you're going to do it now before it happens and prevent it if we can. Otherwise, it's all over. It's that serious.
And that grim picture too that you painted is like that is like kind of what some people, I think that some people want, are kind of actively saying that they want that grim picture to like come about. Like, I don't know how much you know about like the World Economic Forum and that kind of, they're kind of telling us that is going to happen in a way. And
that's what they want us to believe. You know, if we are convinced that it is going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it, then all resistance stops. That's part of their psychological program, is to, what was it? Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, the Chinese warrior, says the supreme excellence in warfare is to defeat your enemy without having to engage him in battle. You just convince him it's coming and there's nothing you can do about it. And a lot of our very religious friends have been torpedoed that way. They say, well, it's all prophesied. You can't stop it. It's God's will. And they back away. They don't do anything to resist it. It's God's will. How can you know, oh my gosh. And they don't realize that our enemies are actually funding pastors in the pulpit from preaching that. Because they want people to back away and do nothing. It's a serious business. And these professionals know what they're doing. These guys that are doing this, and women too, are shrewd.
Yeah, we have to protect ourselves from even such things as demoralization. You gave that great interview with Yuri years ago, and he lays out a lot of things to stay away from just as a citizen, like ideological subversion, demoralization, all the things that render you inactive from actually fighting the system. So I guess as a concluding statement here, can you kind of give some advice for the average person in this scenario? I mean, I know it's like become educated is a good one. And that's part of what we're on our journey here trying to do is do that very thing. But in terms of like tangible advice going forward, you know, how do we avoid revelations and, you know, maybe bring some kind of heaven down to earth, so to speak?
Well, we're in that heaven on earth right now. We have to preserve it. Well, I get that question a lot in different forms. I'm just one person. What can the average person do against this megalithic oppression? They're everywhere. They're in the banking system, in the media, the schools, the churches. They're everywhere. They've got control over us. What can the average person do? And my answer is stop being average. The average person can do nothing. So sit back and say, oh my goodness, what's happening? What's going to be next? It never crosses his or her mind that this is their obligation to be active in this contest, that they have to get into the arena, that they have to get onto the field. They have to get their intellectual and spiritual muskets. I'm not talking about, this is not a war of muskets. There was a time when wars were pretty much determined by how many men you had in the field and how many muskets. They were all the same muskets on both sides. And which ones had the greatest courage, but that's not true anymore. I mean, with the technology we have, a small group of people, of technology-minded people with a couple of powerful generators of electricity can produce, weapons, energy weapons that can wipe out tens of thousands of people. But and it's not musket against musket anymore. And besides, the real war is not that way. The real war is going on for our minds and our attitudes. That's how we're losing the war, and that's how we're going to win the war. So to your question, aside from just not being average, that means we have to get up off of our couches, our back couches, and get into the arena, which means into the public sight. We have to make noise. We have to let people know where we stand and what we think and why. We need to educate them and be assertive, not aggressive, but assertive. And don't be afraid of what they think. Oh, they're going to, I don't want to be controversial. I don't want to lose my position. Maybe I'll be promoted, but if I get too outspoken, I may even lose my job. No, all of that has got to be put aside. We're fighting for our lives now. And so that's the first step. And the next step, we have to realize that part of the argument that what can I do as one person is true. As one person, you can't do very much. Right. But as two people, or three or four or 6 or 10 or 12 or 20, now you've got power. I've seen this in my own experience over the years. When two people work together, they have the effective power of 4 working separately. It's a multiplier. If 3 people work together, they can accomplish the end product of 9. If 4, they can accomplish the end product of 16, 5 of 25, and so forth. It squares. And so you can imagine when you get 30 or 40 or 50 people together, it's 50 times 50. And that's easy to do in a small community. If you have your stuff together and you know what your message is and you know what your goals are and you've got your principles and you can speak about them and defend them, you can organize 30 to 50 people. And with that power, you can dominate and influence your local politics. You can make sure the city council is on board. You get the mayor, you get the county council, you get the school board, the sheriff. Now you're talking. Now you're talking about making a difference. You build this movement from the bottom up, not from the top down. People think, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Who am I going to vote for? They think, you look at the list. The list has already been chosen. Now, which one of those people chosen by my enemy am I going to which one am I going to like? No, it's over by that time.
Yeah,
you've got to be part of the group that puts forth candidates. You've got to know these people eyeball to eyeball. You have to be bond with your fellow workers, which means we have to get out and do what our opponents do. And that's why I created Freedom Force International and the Red Pill Project, the Red Pill University and Red Pill Expos. And we're building Red Pill campuses in every county in the United States right now. Wow. And the whole purpose of these campuses is to do what I just said. So yes, it's doable. It can be done. And we just have to do it. That's all. We have the plan. It works. It's been tested. It's working now. So the answer to the question is, we have the answer. Just do it.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that is the true white pill. Is that as much as these people have power, so to speak, the real power lies within the people, and it's just a matter of coming together and doing exactly what you're saying. And it's not all hope is lost until it's all over. And really, you shouldn't be demoralized whatsoever. It's never over. It'll never
be all over, but it could be stagnated for a long, long, long time. I mean, it might take many generations to recover if we lose this. Many generations. So we just don't want to let that happen.
Right.
Fortunately, the window is still open, and it's up to us to take advantage of the moments we have.
Yes, sir.
So let's close this by saying we have an event coming up in August. This video might last long after August of 2023, but August 12 and 13 in Des Moines, Iowa, we've got a Red Pill Expo coming up, and we'll be talking about this thing, right? I'm talking the campuses and other things, and we'll be organizing and bringing people together to form campuses in their communities. So come on by and be part of that, and bring your friends and your stout-hearted friends. That's what we need, stout-hearted friends.